and a faculty member of the Neurology Department at Johns Hopkins. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson. Dr. Jackson's expertise is in comprehensive community revitalization, systems change, dynamics of race and ethnicity, and the role of arts and culture in communities. She's the Institute Professor at Arizona State University with appointments in the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts and the Watt College for Public Service and Community Solutions. At ASU, she is also the director of the Studio for Creativity, Place, and Equitable Communities. President Obama appointed Dr. Jackson to the National Council on the Arts. She advises national and regional initiatives on cultural equity and changing demographics, and works at the intersection of the arts and other areas of policy and practice, such as community planning, development, and health. Prior to working directly with foundations in higher education for almost 20 years, she was based at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., where she led pioneering applied work on comprehensive community development, arts, and culture in low-income and historically marginalized communities, support systems for artists and culture bearers, and indicators of cultural vitality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jackson as she shares her thoughts on reimagining place, identity, healing, and justice. Thank you, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Susan. And I'd like to thank the series organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts with you today. My background in urban planning and community development led me actually to a focus on arts, culture, and design as a dimension of all of that. For more than 25 years, my work is focused on integrating arts and culture into comprehensive community development and planning. And this commitment to integrating arts and culture into that work, it hasn't always been easy. That particular intersection has been challenging. Early in my career, I was often asked by well-meaning colleagues who knew that I was very interested in impacting social justice issues, working towards building healthy neighborhoods where all people could thrive, and community development related concerns. And early on, I was often asked, if you care about poor people, you care about historically marginalized groups, you care about communities of color and advancing their well-being, why are you doing this arts and culture stuff? And the question came to me as if people were seeing this commitment to arts and culture as part of community development and planning as if it were off mission or somehow a distraction. I had lost my way, so to speak. And it was a difficult thing to hear. And I knew in my gut that this was precisely the work that I was called to do, because I knew from familial experience that the embrace of humanity through the practice of arts and culture is part of what allows historically marginalized communities individually and collectively to persist. So I knew this. I knew this from personal experience. I knew this from familial experience. And eventually I got to the point where I could answer the question about why do this work at this intersection by asking people to think if around the world and throughout the ages, in strategies to disempower people, the first thing that one tinkers with in efforts to subordinate or oppress is the people's ability to make sense of the world, to tell stories, to have aesthetics, to have values in terms of how they want to determine their life, what their narrative is going to be. And all of this happens in large part through cultural expression, through arts and culture. So if we know that it's so important that people have to tinker with it or remove the ability to do it, if we know that it's so important that people have used that as a subjugation strategy, an oppression tactic, then why don't we understand it as central to building up communities? Why is that missing in our strategies around community development and planning? So I've persisted at this intersection, and while I've talked about this work as integration into community development and planning, as I get older and I reflect on the work more deeply, the language that I'm using to describe the work is beginning to change. And I'm in a position to talk more explicitly about the integration of arts and culture and community development really having to do with reckoning with harm, with reckoning with dehumanization, with the need to heal, to restore dignity, and to tend to our humanity. And I think that these are critically important priorities that we haven't prioritized in the community development and planning fields. We don't reckon with all of this. And as a result, I think that while there's a lot of good work that happens out of that field, I think our bar is low. We aspire to help people survive often and not necessarily thrive. And the aspiration to thrive has everything to do with reckoning with harm, with dehumanization, with the need to heal, the need to restore dignity, and the tending to our humanity. So over the last 10 years or so, there has been increasing attention in the community development and planning fields to a concept called creative placemaking. And some of you may have heard that term, or for some of you it may be new. But during the Obama administration, as there was increased interest in the importance of place in determining outcomes of all sorts for people. So, you know, where you grew up is likely to determine a lot about how well you do in life or your ability to reach your full potential. And as policies and programs that focused on place and intended to be comprehensive began to become popular again, or they became part of our national policy for a while. I think the arts field, through the National Endowment for the Arts, was particularly interested in understanding how could the arts and culture field play a role in this urban policy context. And the concept of placemaking itself is older. It's more than 10 years old. It comes out of the 1960s and 70s urban planning and urban design fields. And it was in some ways a reaction to planning tactics that had really detrimental effects on communities. This is including urban renewal and a lot of racialized policies and land use planning practices that resulted in very unequal communities and the exacerbation of racial inequity in place. And place making came after that and was in some ways not particularly a response to racism and racist planning practices, but certainly to planning practices that centered the automobile and a dehumanized way of understanding the urban landscape. So this notion of placemaking really underscored people's participation in creating the places and being stewards of the places where they live and work. In 2011, the National Endowment for the Arts revived the term placemaking and added creative to it. And through creative placemaking as a calling card, if you will, sought to get a seat at the table in the urban policy context, where the arts and culture field could see itself as a contributor vis-a-vis this concept of creative placemaking. It's evolved over the last 10 years, and for people like me and many others who were doing this integration of arts, culture, and design in community development for many years prior, this interest in creative placemaking lifted up our work, and I think continues to have some currency. And for creative placemaking to actually do the things that I've been talking about earlier, this reckoning with harm and dehumanization and violence to cultural root, if you will, I think that there are some guiding principles that are important to heed. And let me just say that the term creative placemaking, it's an interesting and useful umbrella to advance this work, but the term is imperfect and sometimes can be distracting and even misleading. But in the work that I wish to advance, which we may think of as equitable creative placemaking or creative placemaking with a justice intention, there are some things that I think you need to believe. And one is that creativity is an individual and community asset from which to build. So we are all creative beings, and that is part of a part of our life that we need to be intentional about cultivating. Secondly, cultural self-determination is a crucial part of equity and justice. So again, the ability to own your own narrative, to make sense of the world, to be generative and create is part of equity and justice. Cultural participation takes many forms and happens in a wide range of places is another important idea. And I think it's counter to the thinking that art and culture only happen in places that are designated cultural venues. In fact, cultural participation can happen in community centers, in schools, in homes, and in businesses all around us. There's no shortage to places, contexts where we have expressive life. Another idea is that art and creative process can be more important than the art product. And sometimes that's hard to understand because we've been socialized to think almost exclusively about the thing that we consume, the cultural thing that we consume, at the exclusion sometimes of the creative process of, again, just asserting as humans. Another thought is that artists have many kinds of relationships with publics as well as roles in communities. So they are not just the makers of these artistic widgets to be consumed, but they have relationships with people in neighborhoods, and some of the most important relationships are those that have to do with how artists help us take responsibility for our own creative lives and creative well-being. And last, art and cultural activity. The activity has intrinsic value, period, and it contributes to other community conditions. And we tend in the community development field to, I think, overemphasize the possible contribution to economic development. But in fact, it contributes to many other things that are really important, like agency, both individual and collective, social cohesion, the ability to steward a place. These kinds of contributions to social fabric in some ways are important preconditions for other kinds of change, but we haven't really thought of those contributions that way sufficiently in my mind anyway. So one way that I think about arts, culture, and design as really central to community development practice is that art and artists and arts practices help us frame issues in ways that are more truthful and nuanced. And how we approach impacting a place through policy or programs is always anchored in how we frame the issue. So the ability to work with artists, designers, culture bearers, and citizens who just want to think outside the box really has the promise of leading us to some very different ways of understanding issues that we may not have questioned before. So there's a role in the framing. There's a role that has to do with retooling how we work. An example is that in urban planning, it's very common to have charrettes or town halls. These vehicles or methods of getting public input on decisions about built environment or about the design of a program. And through arts practices, we actually find that there are many more ways to enlist people's active contributions to how we create our communities beyond just the town hall. You know, is there a way to be influential vis-a-vis theater practices, or through music, or through film, or through poetry? What are the ways in which we can creatively embrace our civic roles? And I think that some of the things that are happening under the umbrella of equitable creative placemaking allow us to work differently. And I think last, this idea of repair, that I think is in some ways the most important, particularly for historically marginalized communities, communities of color, and people who have experienced violence done to cultural root as a means of oppression, helping us to reckon with harm and do repair to root culture, create the spaces where that healing can happen, and be intentional about understanding that as part of comprehensive community development. That's really critical. And I think that arts and cultural activity is uniquely positioned to help with that. And this is a gap in the community development field where I think we don't reckon with it. We too often pretend that it doesn't exist and that things can progress without reckoning with it. And I think that's a big mistake. So where does that kind of work happen? I've been for a long time now, for about 15 years, working on this concept of cultural kitchens. And the idea is that healthy communities have cultural kitchens. And the origins of my thinking about this concept is that some years ago, I was invited to write a chapter for a book that was on race and inequality in cities. And I was going to write the chapter on arts and culture, the only chapter on arts and culture. The rest was focused on housing and economic development and other things that are much more familiar in planning and community development spheres. And what occurred to me was that one of the ways in which arts and culture gets lifted up in cities is that politicians and others who want to tout the virtues of a place will often say, well, this place is so diverse. And they point to the instances when people come together to celebrate their diversity. So these inclusive moments, right? And I started thinking about that and thinking of communities that are held up as part of the diversity of a place in very celebratory ways. And then thinking about their reality of, you know, where is it that they can go to repair harm that was done to root culture, or where can you go to grow new cultural roots? Because if you're invited to the commons, the expectation is that you are bringing something, right? So if you want to extend the metaphor, if you're invited to the table and you're supposed to bring a cultural contribution, a dish, if you will, where is it that people go to prepare what it is that they want to share? And I started thinking about this idea of cultural kitchens and how important it is as a precondition for the kind of diversity that people want to tout. And I started to interrogate this idea of cultural kitchens. What do I mean by that? And what happens in these places? And it is true that these are places not just of making and generative spaces, but they are also places of healing. They are places where people come to reckon with what happened, where they come to imagine what can be possible as we heal. And I think that this notion of cultural kitchens, again, is something that eludes us as we think about healthy places where all people can thrive. This notion of cultural kitchens, I think, for me, also provides a really interesting bridge to where I'm beginning to see a confluence. And Susan, who introduced me, when I met her, we were doing some work together on this confluence of community development, the arts, and health. And I'm very excited about this possible convergence or this emerging convergence of these different fields, because I see it as an opportunity to shift industry standards in all three fields and really raise the bar in all of the fields to help us do better, to help us reckon with some of the things that we haven't reckoned with. And if we do that and we do it effectively, and there is some new way of working that comes out of this confluence of fields, the question that emerges for me is, what does progress look like? And how do we measure what kind of change we want to see? And there's some challenges inherent in that, because in the same way that we need to raise the bar and think differently about how community change happens in community development and planning, I think there are probably analogous changes that have to happen in the other intersecting fields. And this requires disruption. So from an accountability perspective and an evaluation perspective, I have to ask the question, how do we measure productive disruption when there is confluence? And we are in a moment like this, where there is a pandemic and there is an economic crisis, and there is a really important resurgence of energy around racial equity. And it creates a moment for this confluence to be particularly generative. But how is it that we hold ourselves accountable to rise to that moment? And how do we go about measuring progress or accounting for progress when progress perhaps needs to be disruptive and could be messy, requires us to go beyond our default ways of thinking that we're doing our best work, when it causes us to fundamentally reconsider some of the premises that we've not reconsidered or haven't troubled in a very long time. So this confluence, the possibility that it brings, the moment of generative possibility, it also is entangled with what we know as long haul work. So how do we think about moving forward when we know it's long haul work? How do we plan for it? And how do we think about that long haul work, not just as a marathon, which is a very popular metaphor right now, that this work requires marathon endurance. And I think there's merit to that, but I also think that there's a lot of merit in thinking about this as a relay. And that's something that actually a colleague at ASU, in a conversation, we were talking about long haul work, and someone brought up marathon, and he made a friendly amendment that maybe relay is a more strategic way of thinking about the kind of work that lies ahead. Work that requires us to pass a baton and think about what it is that we want to pass on. So with that, I'm going to stop my comments and hope that I said something useful and something that you want to engage. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Maria, thank you. This is really an extraordinary gift to hear the way that you think about arts and culture. And, you know, I love how you frame the role of arts and culture as being integral to healing and community development and to health. And that it's not a nice to have, but it's essential to human growth and development. I think, you know, arts and culture are a little bit like creative placemaking, in the sense that we use the term all the time, arts and culture, arts and culture. And I would love one of our questions, we already have questions from people, from listeners, and I would encourage people to continue to send questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. But one of the questions that has been asked is, in the use of the term arts and culture, what part of this can be expressed through arts and what cannot? And so when you're thinking about culture, what can you talk more about what you mean by arts and culture? Are you talking about music, storytelling, painting? Do you have to be good at it to do it? How does this language of arts and culture get defined for us?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a tricky one because, again, my root field is not the cultural field in terms of what I was trained in and professionally, how I was intended to affiliate, let's say. And I say arts and culture as a unit because I recognize that when we say art, the limits become barriers. So I'll tell a story that I've told many times. When I was at the Urban Institute early on in this work, we did focus group discussions around the country to try to understand how in moderate and low income communities of color, how was it that people understood the cultural assets that existed there? And we did a pilot focus group discussion that we were trying the questions out before we actually went and did this set of focus group discussions around the country. And the first time we tried the question, naively, we asked, what kind of art is in your community? And too often we got, well, we don't have any. And we'll say, well, say more. What do you mean you don't have any? We don't have any museums. We don't have any theaters. We don't have any concert halls. And what people were talking about were these places that, by virtue of something happening there, the activity gets anointed as art because it happened at the museum or because it happened at, X place, which is a cultural venue. And it was useful to know that those kinds of institutions didn't exist in many of the neighborhoods where we were going to work. But we knew that there were other kinds of things that had to do with people's aesthetic expression and their cultural lives that they found important. So we changed the question and we said, what kinds of things do you find moving, beautiful, challenging in your neighborhood? And then the conversation got really rich and people talked about all kinds of things. They talked about, and it was cultural practices, things that were part of what you did as your everyday lived experience. But they talked about things like community celebrations, parades, festivals, garage bands, people, their aesthetic choices in their homes, storytelling, all kinds of expressive life. And then we asked after, well, do you think that's art? And people would argue. And that was healthy, to be able to consider whether the quotidian expression that is evidence of our humanity, if that is art or not. And honestly, I didn't have and still don't have a dog in that fight. I am not that interested in the pristine parameters around what is in and what is not. What I am interested in is what is it that is part of people's expressive lives that they care enough to want to monitor and protect and advance? And how is it that it contributes to their well-being and their ability to live their full potential? And whether it falls inside or outside of a pristine definition of art, I care less about that. So I think what I'm saying is I use the language because I feel is more inclusive.
Well, word for. And so when we sort of codified these words and seen, as you said, sometimes it's really a disservice to creative self-expression and sharing and celebrating voice. So a couple of other questions that I think us a little further down the road with this aspect around art. The first is, how do you assess and measure arts and culture programs? And also, who delivers them? You know, manifest within a community when you're thinking about it in context to community development.
Great question. So the challenge culture programs, particularly within a community development framework, is an area where there's a lot of work to be done. And part of the challenge is that there has been so much focus on economic development, and I am not in economic development. It is a critically important part of what we need to be. However, it is not 100% of everything that we need to be concerned with. And I think one of the challenges of evaluating the contributions of arts and cultural programs in neighborhoods specifically, and even within systems change strategies, is that the expectation is always, or typically, that the outcome has to be around economic development. And that's the currency of our debates. You know, when we do cost benefit analysis, it's about resources and the economics of something. So I get where it comes from, but in limiting our understanding of the value of the activity to only that, we are really doing ourselves a disservice, because we are not paying attention to things like sense of belonging, like some of the things I mentioned before, like agency, both individual and collective. So figuring out how to integrate metrics that have to do with these really important dimensions of social fabric and critical elements of self-realization, I think, is part of that raising the bar. It's part of potentially what is possible when you have a confluence of health and community development and the arts, when all of us are thinking at the edge of our fields. So I think that the work ahead to figure out how to, one, create appropriate ways of documenting and assessing contributions of arts and culture and integrating them into how we work in ways that are not token but fundamental. I think that is part of what we're charged with. How do we shift the industry standards? How do we raise the bar? How do we question some of the fundamental assumptions about what progress looks like? That's part of the work right now.
And there's an opportunity to shift the paradigm, to change the metrics. And you mentioned messy earlier, and that there's this place where you're making a change and you're not seeing these traditional metrics, and governments and others in power get nervous about that, right? So how do you navigate messy when we haven't done this before, where we haven't valued arts and culture? So you're moving into a new territory. Can you talk about how you move through that space of liminal space of the unknown in these kinds of areas?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds cliche, but there does have to be comfort with discomfort. And, you know, particularly now in a moment where there's so many words, there's so many statements right now coming from everywhere that have to do with affirming alliance with racial equity movements and social justice aspirations. And I think the words are interesting, but when you actually unpack what it takes to achieve the aspiration, it requires systems change, and it requires us to question the structures that have been unquestioned and look again at the kinds of things that we say are important, right? So if you measure what matters, if you really believe in some of the things that people are now saying because they feel like the moment demands that it be said, the kinds of things that those kinds of assertions require are not going to be served by the kinds of evaluation metrics which have been typical, right? And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that everything, or all ways of doing evaluation and measurement are wrong. But now is the time to unsettle our orthodoxies around how we understand progress and how we measure what matters. So again, some of the what people say they want to see requires fundamental disruption of systems. And we're not good at marking progress by celebrating or celebrating unease. And if we really do want to achieve the things that so many people say that they're aspiring to right now, all of that has to get looked at again. We can't be so comfortable to just default the things that we've known or the kinds of markers of success and progress that we've relied on to date. That's inconsistent with a lot of the assertions that are being made right now.
And could you speak a little bit about some of the studies that actually verify that when people are expressing themselves, they do feel more human, they are healthier, they feel disenfranchised? I mean, this isn't that the hypothesis, there's clear literature in this field, right?
There is, I mean, in the community development field, it feels more nascent. I think actually, Susan, in your field, there is more that one would think of as a more evolved body of work, let's say. But there is work that is still a small portion of community development and planning related research that points to, I often think of these as preconditions for other kinds of outcomes, but they're valuable in and of themselves, right? So agency, social cohesion, ideas connected to social capital, this kind of thing. But Susan, maybe you're in a position to offer from the health perspective some of the research that gives credence to what we're talking about.
Well, there is a growing body of literature that comes from neuroscience, neurology, cognitive neuroscience, also public health, that is looking at health and well-being based on different art forms. And I think one of the interesting things that might be most noted is that you don't have to be quote unquote good at it in order to have huge benefits to reducing stress and anxiety. There's some folks at Hopkins that have been doing some work with medicine compliance and the arts, and looking at the role of feeling better about yourself, a sense of quality of life, helping to be more compliant with different kinds of either prescription use or different kinds of physical therapy, occupational therapy. So but the field is very, it's very interdisciplinary, and it's not necessarily interconnected. So the coalescing of this field of neuroaesthetics, neuroarts, that includes community development, is happening, and it's happening very rapidly. It's almost that time is vertical, and these paradigm shifts are happening very quickly. And I think the research, the basic research combined with the practice and the implementation studies and looking at impact on the different metrics is really where the action is. And we're seeing it with things like the military and creative forces, where we're using art for traumatic brain injury and PTSD, and it is working in ways as complementary and integrative with other types of traditional medicine. So it's happening more and more. And I think the military now has expanded their work to over 20 sites around the country using arts as a major intervention.
I'm really glad that you brought up creative forces and the work done there to address post-traumatic stress disorder among people who have been in war. And I would just want to make the bridge between that and post-traumatic stress disorder as identified among people living in persistent poverty. So I've been interested in what Creative Forces has been doing for a long time because it's an important program, period, and because I very clearly see the potential application in the kinds of neighborhoods and among the populations that I've been concerned with outside of a military context, right? So there is documented evidence that children that live in impoverished places often are dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, and not just children, but families in general. And that's not intended to paint low-income communities with a deficit brush, because there's a lot that is positive and valuable. And again, this idea of creative placemaking at its best, it sees value in things and people and places that often are discarded as not having value. And that's one of our biggest mistakes, is the underestimation of people in places that have been disinvested or historically marginalized. I do think there is a bridge there, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, sexual trauma is another example. Domestic violence is another example. Early childhood trauma. All of that work that is happening in communities bridges to what Creative Forces is doing. And Creative Forces has moved from the institutional clinical setting now into the community, and they're looking to bridge because military folks and vets go back into the community wherever they live. So I think that's very promising. I want to shift a little bit.
I want to add one thing, because I'm curious, just to keep the thread with Creative Forces, so much of that work has been in a clinical setting with an arts therapy focus. And I'm really interested in how do our insights about that kind of work translate into what end up being lifestyle realities, right? So how do we go from something happening only in a clinical setting and through therapy to that being part of how we think of healthy places where we live, where it's not clinical and it's not necessarily therapy in the most rigid sense. But when we think about healthy places, how do we incorporate what we know?
Well, and again, words matter, right? So therapy tends to be clinical, yet we know that these life experiences using self-expression can be daily things like exercise or good nutrition. And so who are the people that are stewarding that? And there's a continuum of care of artists who are bedside artists, who are artists using arts in health that are not art therapists. There are social workers that use art, physical therapists, and then there are creative art therapists. So there is a spectrum of workforce that is really available, and I think of it as an army of artists that are trained with different capacities depending upon where they enter, at what level of care that's required. So there's a lot to talk about there. I'd like to switch and come back to this concept of cultural kitchen. It's so powerful, and I'd love for you to really unpack that a little bit. Who owns the cultural kitchen? Where are these cultural kitchens? What are the expectations of privacy and finding identity in a cultural kitchen? Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think that cultural kitchens take many different forms. Sometimes they are actually itinerant. They move from place to place. When you think about, in some cases, the immigrant populations actually offer really important examples of how cultural kitchens are created and cultivated. Some years ago, when I was doing work on the support structure for artists in the US, and I was doing interviews with many different kinds of artists, some of whom were what we think of as folk artists or really heritage, people who are advancing heritage from one generation to the next. So I think these are folks who are the keepers of heritage and culture. And it's interesting in a US context how that evolves. And I was having this conversation with a man in Boston who was getting ready to start a cultural organization for Haitians and for people who were Haitian American as well as Haitian immigrants. And I see that as a really important example of a cultural kitchen. And at the time, he was trying to determine, he knew there was a need for creating a place where people from Haiti and descendants of people from Haiti had the opportunity to, one, preserve the culture, advance the culture, figure out what the culture actually was within a US context. How was it that they wanted to address some of the things that needed to be healed from their own circumstances? Some of the, in Haiti, some of the things that needed to be addressed as it pertained to healing from a US context, as they began to integrate into what one would think of as an African American community. So what happens when that evolution is part of your reality, right? How do you connect to this group that you are being connected to by virtue of being part of the African diaspora in the US context? And he was struggling with some really interesting questions, like what kind of organizational form did it need to take? You know, was it going to be a 501c3 nonprofit organization? Was it going to be an informal thing? Was there a business component to this? He was asking questions about what was going to be the official language of the organization. Was it French? Was it Creole? Was it English? How was it that they wanted to assert publicly? How porous or not porous did the organization need to be? And this is to your point, Susan, about these cultural kitchens sometimes need to be closed. And they need, these are spaces that require intimacy and healing and reckoning on your own terms. And I think when that is the case, sometimes it makes people uncomfortable because it's not all open all the time. You have to be invited in. And sometimes that's hard for people to hear, that it's not, there are permissions that are necessary and appropriately, I think. But it's a complex quality of a cultural kitchen, particularly in a context where we are socialized to think that open all the time for everybody is what needs to happen, when you're dealing with groups that have to process trauma and have to reckon with harm and are in the process of healing. Sometimes that porousness isn't what is necessary. And there are some other protocols to inclusion that are at their discretion. And sometimes that's hard for people to accept.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really helpful and so insightful. A couple questions that I want to bring forward from some of the folks writing in. One is this question about, in a healthcare institution like Hopkins, in a city like Baltimore, how does a healthcare institution be a leader at that convergence? How do they implement or ignite that convergence? What are the practical steps? Tomorrow we will X. How do they get this going?
When you say this, are you talking about the convergence of the fields? Are you talking about cultural kitchens, or what are you?
Sorry, the convergence of the fields. How do we begin to move that forward? They are intersecting, as you said. There's an opportunity to raise the bar. What are some concrete steps that an institution, a healthcare institution, can do?
Well, I mean, Hopkins in particular is a particularly powerful ally in this work by virtue of it being a medical institution as well as an institution of higher education. So you have the capacity to change practice within the institution itself as a medical institution, and you have the opportunity to influence how future generations of people in the health field will understand and execute their responsibilities. So I think from a setting the industry standards is something that an entity like Hopkins is uniquely positioned to, or importantly positioned, let's say, to be a leader in that way, right? It is a reputable, albeit imperfect for sure, a reputable institution that people look to, and being able to lead by recognizing the confluence of the fields, the necessity to unsettle orthodoxies. That's all things that, to some extent, you all have the wherewithal to lead. Whether it's through the higher education lens in terms of curriculum development and how you are training the next generations of people in the health field to assume their responsibilities and understand their role. So in terms of really pragmatic things, what faculty are doing to unsettle their own orthodoxies or advance work that's already going in this direction, I think that's really important.
Yeah, and community development is, we are part of a community, so there's an opportunity to do quite a bit in the community with the community. A couple other questions. I know we're going to run short on time, and there's lots of folks that want to know more. Can you talk a little bit about once you really get once you help a community begin to bring forward the arts and culture that's innate in that community, how does it become sustainable and continuing in a community? And I know that you have some great examples of some of these programs, maybe an example of a program that you've seen be very successful.
Yeah, I think that community organizations that create the base from which practitioners can operate is really important. So when I think about healthy neighborhoods, one of the things that I would look for is, do these community institutions that can serve as cultural kitchens, if you will, or that can be the base of people who are transmitting cultural practices from one generation to the next, do they even exist in neighborhoods, right, is one question. There are several examples that come out of an initiative that I was involved with for a number of years, which was a collaboration between the California Endowment through its Building Healthy Communities initiative, which was a 10-year initiative, I think now in its final year or close to final year, and the Alliance for California Traditional Arts. And in this, this was very much, the Building Healthy Communities initiative is very committed to environmental determinants of health outcomes. So they are looking to the community development, social work, and other fields as allies in what they're up to. And in this case, they also reached out to Alliance for California Traditional Arts, which has done a lot of work with traditional art forms. And when I say traditional art forms, what people think of as, and I'm not crazy about the language, but folk life, if you will. These quotidian expressions of aesthetic values and ways in which people organize their lives. And as part of the work, there were several sites around the state where Alliance for California Traditional Arts was working with artists who call themselves artivists, because they have activist art practices, and they were very familiar with vernacular art forms of certain neighborhoods. there's a dog, I apologize. Can't do much about that right now. But the,
Part of it.
the example that I want to raise is that as part of one of the campaigns of the Building Healthy Communities initiatives in Boyle Heights, a part of Los Angeles, which is heavily Chicano, Mexican American, people of Mexican origin and other Latin American origins. But there was an intention to help people become aware of the Affordable Care Act. And the way that they ended up doing that was in collaboration with this wonderful woman, Ofelia Esparza, who was a multi-generational altar maker of Mexican origin, has been an educator also, has been recognized nationally now for her beautiful altar making and the practices that she imparts to people of all ages. And they enlisted her help in working with women with low incomes out of primarily public housing, but it was affordable housing communities where they were asked to think about, for some of them for the first time, their own well-being. These are women who are tending to children, they're tending to family, they've got jobs, they've got all kinds of other concerns and seldom have time for themselves. And through this altar making process, combined with this health approach, she was getting them to reckon with their own physical processing of some of the stresses that they deal with on the day-to-day. So when you're worried that your sons are out and they may be involved with police brutality or gang-related issues or any number of things, or you are feeling vulnerable in terms of your housing situation, where is it that you feel it physically? And she was helping them to become embodied in their reality and think about how is it that they, as individual women, could actually acknowledge that and do something about it. And it was kind of a meandering and long way into, if you have the full recognition that your external circumstances are impacting you physically and psychologically, and that is connected to venues that could be helpful, like healthcare. Connecting those dots in the process of having this intimate space to be able to talk about things that you haven't been invited to talk about before, and make they were personal altars that they ended up making as a part of this process that was part of their own commitment to themselves and their community. And it was this very beautiful art-based, culturally appropriate way of connecting people in the most intimate way, physically and emotionally, to their environment and to policy solutions potentially. And that was powerful. It was a really powerful program.
It's a beautiful example of how you can look at this sense of embodied cognition and feel something that you maybe haven't felt, and especially for women in that community who are really the glue and are suffering greatly with lots of chronic health issues, largely in part of stress and marginalized situations. So that's a beautiful story, and maybe a great place to stop. Let me give you the final word. In walking away today, what would you like our community to take with us? What's the most important thing that you'd like for us to take with us as we close out today?
This confluence of fields, potentially, this, arts, community development, health, in this moment of pandemic, of economic distress, and of heightened awareness of racial injustice. If we don't figure out how to seize this time to radically reimagine what's possible, we have failed. And I think that the inclusion of concern for tending to our humanity, which requires attention to arts and cultural practices, is an essential part of the suite of things that needs to come together to meet the moment. So I would want to end with that.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. It's really so enlightening and so informative, and I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. So Victoria, I'm going to turn it back over to you for some closing remarks, I believe.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson and Susan, for all the work that you've done, and Dr. Jackson for being with us today. Next week we will hear from Vanita Gupta, and the time is a little different. Next week, instead of our usual 3:30 time, we will be here at 4:30 p.m. So folks may need to make a little adjustment on their calendar. But thank you again, and we'll see everybody next week at 4:30. Take care.